Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue on with our journey through the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2020. Now I'd like to focus our attention, very briefly if I may, on a recent box set release that the Criterion Collection made. This is a phenomenal, extraordinary release, and it has fast become one of my favorite releases of the year. It is my great pleasure to share with you some thoughts that I have about this, which is itself, the set itself, being on spine number 1044. And it is this: Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project, number 3. So for purposes of this video, let me just say from the outset that I plan to make separate videos going forward, focusing in on each of the films included in this set. So with that in mind, I won't be speaking specifically about the films right now for this video, but please check back to this channel wherein I will very shortly, I hope, start to upload videos talking about each of the individual films included in this magnificent set. So for purposes of today, let me now focus my comments on a broad general level regarding Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project number 3, which is right here. The World Cinema Project box sets are among my absolute favorites in the Criterion Collection, and with number 3, which is right here, I can safely say that this is one of my absolute favorite releases of this year. And the importance and greatness of sets like this, and in particular number 3, I think is due to a number of reasons. First, the fact that we are getting a number of absolutely phenomenal works of cinema. And I'm speaking really directly in terms of an emotional, powerful experience. These films are incredibly powerful, and they resonate, and they will echo for many years after you've seen these films. So to have them here like this, in a collection like this, is brilliant. And we should say that the films themselves are an example of the important work of restoration and trying to save and preserve and restore films from many parts of the world that might not otherwise get as much attention as, say, other cinemas of other parts of the world. And so my point here is that we are getting wonderful examples of restored works of films that are from areas of cinema that deserve a lot of attention. And that's for sure. And so that is another reason why sets like this are important. Related to that, I think sets like this really help, and they are very, for lack of a better word, educational. And I mean that in a specific context, which is that, as you know, cinema is a very wide and vast ocean filled with so many films. For instance, I often remark that for every one film I see, I can safely say that probably there are maybe 10,000, 100,000 films out there that I will never get to see. And that's due to the amount of artists out there, that's due to the amount of films that are out there. It's endless, voluminous and endless, and that's the way it should be, because it's an example of the vastness of human expression all over the world. So but at the same time, we always have to consider, or at least I always have to consider in my mind, what is cinema? right? What is cinema? And to be more specific, I always have to keep in mind that my view of cinema is always reliant or dependent on my own view and my own outlook, which is, of course, reliant and dependent on my life experience, my educational background, and specifically with that, my exposure to various forms of cinema around the world is usually extremely limited. And why I say this is because I am always exposed primarily to films based on, say, decisions made by film distributors around in the marketplace, and also that includes decisions made by labels, Blu-ray labels, DVD labels that decide to release certain films and the like, as well as accessibility and reach based on my own financial resources. And so this is also further embellished by the fact that a lot of the concept of cinema that I rely on is usually based on a certain paradigm or understanding of what the great aspects of cinema are. And that usually relies on what we could call a canonical view of cinema. In other words, the great films are usually ones that are mentioned by these great films of all time lists, well-known, regarded critics or scholars or academics from certain parts of the world, and that sort of thing. And so I think over time, a kind of canon of cinema grows, which might be said to be from a Western perspective. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, of course, because cinema is subjective and it, of course, relies on a certain area of perspective. So that's very important. But what is also important is an understanding or an appreciation of the fact that perhaps this one approach to cinema, this kind of Western-based canonical approach to cinema, is not always the only approach to cinema. And I think that's the key. If we can appreciate this point, then we can realize, therefore, that beyond this is a whole wealth of expression, of film language expression and ideas and import that means that the whole world becomes a place of great exploration and ideas and exchange of thought. Which is therefore to say that we can see cinema through many lenses. And because of this, we have to understand, or I have to always understand and try to remind myself that the vastness of cinema is so great that it cannot be assigned to just one view, one paradigm, one canon, but it is in fact a multitude of viewpoints. And with that appreciation in hand, then I think sets like this become absolutely essential, because these form these form themselves a means by which one can begin to have a good appreciation for the multitude of canons, and also one can try to get a perspective as to what else can be made available through filmmakers whose films are featured here. Maybe this forms a gateway for other films to be explored by consumers of this particular product. And also, it forms a gateway to different areas of the world that are being represented in one way or another through the cinema works that are being contained in sets like this. And so there is a whole myriad of possibility of learning and education, which is why I opted to use that word earlier in the video. Which is all to say that sets like this are illuminating and fascinating and very important. Let me say also in conclusion, before I go into some of the details of the set and the essay in particular, that I think on the one hand, to be perfectly honest, I am torn. I am actually torn in terms of the presentation of films like this in this set. On the one hand, I am of the mind that a set like this is essential, and I would hope that many people could watch these films either if they're available here or maybe if they're available through other means, maybe the Criterion channel. If so, please check them out. But in any event, sets like this are really wonderful to have. At the same time, there's always a kind of aura and specialness that is associated with individual releases of films. And so I always would hope that maybe we could have films like this that could be assigned their own individual release. And I think this point is I consider it a very important point because one thing that I always want to urge people, and I have to make this reminder to myself as well, is that it is very easy to, I think, assign the phrase world cinema to films like this. In other words, there is the cinema that is maybe of the canon, the Western canon, that is perhaps known to many of us. And the films that we consider classics are often regarded in this context. And I think that's fine. And then there's the other stuff, right? The other cinema of the world, which is grouped in this one large group, which is called other cinema or world cinema. And so I think there is that dynamic which is often employed in film discussion and the like. And I don't see anything inherently wrong with that. But what I would want to suggest is that a kind of world cinema or other cinema kind of classification isn't really doing the films justice, because each film has its own import and significance and importance that is oftentimes very much localized, thus making all these films that are otherwise collectively gathered in the overarching umbrella categorization of world cinema. In fact, these films are very much strikingly different from each other. Thus, it is, I think, much more appropriate to consider them in their own specific contexts and categories, if you will. Thus, sets like this, I think, are fine, but there is also something to be said about making individual releases of this to really underline the point that the moniker of world cinema or other cinema might not necessarily explain the whole story when it comes to films that are included in a set like this. So that's always the point that I always that I always felt. And so it would have been nice, for example, to have some of these films in their own specific individual Blu-ray releases, for example. But that being said, I still say this, and I still regard sets like this to be important and valuable, because when it comes to the idea of an educational reach of films like this, which are admittedly not necessarily the most well-known in the world, I think putting a spotlight on films like this in a package like this does do the films a lot of excellent benefit and justice. And so my view on this is maybe twofold, but I think it's possible to carry both concepts in one's mind. Maybe they're contradictory, and still have high regard for sets like this. I hope that makes sense. But in any event, I do believe, however, in terms of the packaging, that's the point I wanted to make. But when we explore the specifics, the nitty-gritty of what's being offered here, I think we can obviously discover and realize that what the Criterion Collection is doing here is really affording each of the films in this set its own due and its own localized discussion, which is also linked to a universality among the films, which therefore leads to an accessibility vis-a-vis the film, vis-a-vis the viewer. And I think these discussions are important. These are the types of discussions that Criterion has with all of its films. And so therefore, when we explore the set specifically, then I think we realize that the treatment that the Criterion Collection and World Cinema Project are giving to sets like this, I think, is magnificent. And so that's the kind of roundabout thinking that I have with regard to sets like this and the other WCP sets as well. But I do want to make that point. And in fact, one of the great things about the booklet is that it includes a lot of essays, included in which is a foreword, which is by Cecilia Cenciarelli. And this is called Restoration as Reimagining History, starting on page 8 of the booklet. And it's a very long, robust, excellent foreword, which talks in brief about each of the films as a sort of overarching perspective. And also, Cenciarelli makes some brilliant points about the idea of the established canon, which is oftentimes given in terms of the context of film discussions vis-a-vis the Criterion Collection, is oftentimes perhaps, at least described in the foreword anyway, perhaps from the perspective of the Western canon. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, as I say, and I think Cenciarelli acknowledges. But there is also something to be said about the multitude of canons across the entire vastness of cinema. And so I think she makes this point much more effectively than I. And she goes on further to say that one of the effective tools to have a better establishment of an appreciation of these multitude of canons and the various paradigms in cinema and cinema appreciation and cinema understanding that exist. One of the most effective tools in this effort is restoration. And the idea of restoration and the tools that have been improved over time up to now that give restorers and film historians the tools and abilities to be able to restore heretofore difficult or oftentimes unavailable, difficult to find or unavailable works. Thus means that we can shed light on those works that have otherwise not been made available or have not been given as much critical attention as, say, other films from other parts of the world. And so this helps to redefine the paradigms that exist. And also, too, the notion of the recognition and imagining or reimagining of a historical perspective that is expressed through these cinematic forms that have perhaps heretofore not necessarily been given as much attention for whatever reason, whether the reason is due to lack of availability of high quality source materials, or maybe lack of availability of funds needed to carry out the restorations up to now, or maybe other reasons due to distribution details, or maybe due to socio-political reasons. Whatever the case may be, there has been a relative lack of availability, relatively speaking. And so restoration tools and these films coming back to light also shed light on the types of historical concerns that a lot of these films have, all of these films have in fact, and social concerns that these films have. And one of the great powerful tools of cinema, as we know, is the idea of it in some way bringing history to life. Now, I know it's a much more complex situation than that, because cinema as history is much more complex, and we as viewers have to really grapple with each film that we watch in order to be able to have a best approach to processing the material and the content that we see with films and also with other forms of art. But be that as it may, having the cinema or the piece of cinema exist in the form that it does in restore projects like the WCP project gives us the opportunity and wherewithal and the chance to be able to engage in this process as viewers. And so I think this point raised by Cenciarelli in this forward essay, as well as the other points that she raises, as well as the specifics that she brings up for each of the films, all these points are masterfully expressed by her. So I do want to recommend very much the Cenciarelli essay, if you can read it. Once again, it's called Restoration as Reimagining History. And that is, I think, a full and quite a convincing statement on the set itself and the importance of the set. And lastly, let me say, before I leave you in this video, let me say that ultimately it comes down to the films themselves. And as of now, I have had the great opportunity to explore these films on a number of occasions. And so, and now I watch them here again, and I see that each of them, in their own way, they have a power. Each has its power and significance. and the impact of the films is undeniable. And I cannot wait. I'm so excited for the upcoming videos on each of these films. And so I hope to see you in the future, wherein I will have the great honor of being able to share with you some thoughts I have about each of the films, as I say, included in this set. Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project #3. This is a must-have, an absolute must-have. So please consider it if you are interested. What a wonderful set this is. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so once again, I will see you in some upcoming videos on the specific films on this set going forward. But in the meantime, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much for your time, as always, my dear friends, and cheers.